Hello guys and welcome back. Let us continue with the Jagdtiger. We spent a lot of time last part painting and chipping this monster, but now we have to cover that work with a variety of mud textures. Let's hope we don't ruin all the previous work. We start with a basic pinwash. Instead of a pre-mixed enamel one, I will be using oil colors, which I already drained on a piece of cardboard. A good place to test the wash are the wheels. I might prefer a darker tone, but let's see how this one looks once it's dry. In the last episode I applied a coat of clear satin varnish over the entire model. Usually for a wash, a glossy surface is preferred as it helps the wash flow into and around all the details. But oil paints work a little bit different than enamel washes. Its pigments are a lot finer, but they work better on a slightly less smooth surface in order to grip onto it. This will become even more apparent once the blending process begins later. One thing I have already noticed about this shade of oil paint is that it acts like a kind of local filter. In the last episode I deliberately desaturated the camouflage colors somewhat to make the entire Jagdtiger look more aged. This brown tone, however, brings the saturation to the color and thus creates a color difference even across the larger surfaces. Definitely not what I intended first, but certainly a helpful side effect. And that's one point where I think oil paints are far superior to enamel paints. Pre-mixed washes don't blend as smoothly and tend to leave harsh transitions if you're not careful. And since we are on the topic of blending, I simply use a little bit of white spirit, which I also used to thin the oil paint beforehand. This allows me to remove unwanted smudges and, as mentioned before, soften the transitions. But after the wash dried, I actually found the color a bit pale in some places. On the brown and green, the wash wasn't even really visible. Therefore, I'm now adding a second wash, this time with a much darker shade of brown. This is also the color I believe I used on my Jagdpanther. As for washes, I find a fairly strong contrast very appealing. It might not always be the most realistic, but it certainly helps to make the details and areas much more visible and emphasize them. Especially here on the roof, with the hatches and periscopes, such a contrast looks good, as otherwise the whole thing can quickly look flat and boring. And that reminds me, I completely forgot to attach the hatch for the commander. I hadn't attached it yet because I wasn't sure whether to put a figure in here or not. But now that the decision is final, I can glue it on after I have painted it dark yellow. Now a quick chipping and a wash here too, and the hatch will match the rest of the tank. The dark yellow of the hatch is slightly different from the rest of the vehicle, but that's not a problem at all. Quite the opposite, in fact. The hatches were most likely hand-painted by the crew later, as the typically white hatches would have minimized the camouflage effect. Therefore, a slightly different shade of yellow makes perfect sense here. Now for some rust effects, also using oil paints. I originally wanted to use this enamel effect for this, but I have noticed that it turns a very strange light orange after drying, so I didn't really like that. I now apply the oil wash in varying amounts, first on the spare track links. Since these hang motionless on the superstructure, heavier rust forms here quite quickly. I'm now doing the same on the tow ropes and tools. I want them to look rusty, but not too rusty. After all, the tools will be in use and not just hang down from an abandoned vehicle. That's also why we used the grey color in the last episode. Rust tones always look great on this, because you can quickly and easily achieve color variations by using different intensities of the rust effect. Do you remember the perhaps somewhat strange chipping on the exhaust from the last episode? That was also the basis for working with rust washes here. The light grey is now turned a light orange by the wash, while the dark brown chipping remains as the darker rust spots. Next we need to address the vertical surfaces. Streaking effects are always excellent for this, especially since the Jagdtiger is so incredibly tall. First, I apply some color to the top edge in irregular amounts. Don't worry if this looks like it's going to be a huge mess, that is all intentional. Instead of letting the paint dry a little first, I now start blending it directly using vertical movements. While most of the paint ends up in the brush, I'm also able to create very fine streaks, which are almost invisible on camera. As you can see, the mess blended very quickly, leaving almost no color. I still find this type of effect relatively difficult to control or predict. Therefore, I prefer to apply several thin layers until I achieve the desired effect, rather than applying too much at once. However, you should leave some time between the layers to allow the previous streaks to dry, otherwise you will just end up wiping away all your work. All the tools and tow ropes naturally make things a bit more difficult, as they are simply in the way. Therefore, it can be easier to keep all these things separate, although then you have a bunch of extras that you have to deal with individually. I also apply this effect to the front armor plate. Same principle as on the sides. Theoretically, you could also do it on the lower armor plate, although mud effects will be added here later anyway. And we will start with those mud effects right now. In the first step, I will use this rough mud texture from AK Interactive. Of course, I will start with the rear wheels too. If the effect doesn't look good, it's easier to correct any mistakes that way. This is an acrylic based mud effect, primarily intended for dioramas. However, it can also be used very effectively in small quantities on vehicles. My main goal is to create texture and volume with it. Not only is this product more economical per unit of volume than for example an enamel matte effect, but it also becomes rock hard and virtually indestructible once completely dry. The whole thing can be thinned and blended with tap water. The transitions will remain rougher, but that's not a problem, this is just the first step anyway. I do the same thing for the lower hull and running gear as well. It is important to pay attention to where and how much mud accumulates. The mud that falls off the tracks collects in these areas. Therefore, it makes sense that this happens most at the rear when the tank is moving forward, or at the front when the tank is reversing. While this doesn't keep the center clean, it does make it less dirty. While this texture is still wet, it can sometimes be difficult to estimate how it will look when it is completely dry. So I prefer to apply a little less here, rather than accidentally applying too much. And while adding more water makes it easier to blend, it also inevitably makes the surface smoother. Therefore, it's necessary to wait a while until the texture starts to dry, and then carefully stipple the surface to re-add some texture. Mud and dirt also accumulate on the front parts and on the rear, but in a slightly different way. The Jagdtiger gets dirty in these areas primarily when it's pushing through deeper mud and rougher terrain. And since I don't intend to leave the tank standing in meters of mud, I'm mainly focusing on the lower edge and the corners. I'll only apply small amounts of the mud to the rear. Since my Jagdtiger still has both rear mud guards, it's logical that these will catch most of the mud, as that is their intended purpose. But a little will naturally still accumulate here. Of course, that means that even more dirt collects directly on the mud flaps, and I can apply a proper layer here. I also used this product for my first coat on the tracks. However, I will dilute it a bit more with water to get a very thick wash. But caution is advised with this technique. I wouldn't use it on a very brittle or poorly designed track. The dry acrylic wash will affect the flexibility of the individual track links, and they will need to be forced back into the correct position if necessary. Weak tracks can break very easily in this process. The acrylic effect should now fully harden and dry for at least 24 hours before we continue here. In the meantime, we can focus on the effects visible on the top. Here I'm using real, finely sifted soil as a base. I carefully sprinkle this in small amounts around the hedges, flaps and into all sorts of corners. The engine deck is particularly well suited for this. Not only is it a very large area with many nooks and crannies, but it's also an area where the crew would move around very regularly, since the large crew hatch is located here. Since I apply the soil dry first, I can still adjust its position with a brush afterward. One advantage of natural soil is its inherent randomness. There are small lumps, larger pieces and fine dust. You can hardly get any closer to reality than that. In addition to real soil, I also use small fibers that I cut from a ball of seagrass. This is also a natural product, which is why the small fibers are all different. Compared to static grass, however, it has a realistic color, which in my opinion remains the biggest problem with all the artificial products. On a diorama, such unrealistic colors aren't that big of a problem, since it's easier to adjust everything and match the overall look. But on a tank with individual blades of grass, I imagine it would be very tedious to try and paint them one by one. Now, of course, I need to fix everything somehow. For this, I am using Pigment Fixer from AK Interactive. It's a thin liquid enamel adhesive with a corresponding low surface tension. To apply it, I use an old brush loaded with the adhesive. When I touch the surface, the capillary reaction causes the adhesive to be practically absorbed by the soil and grass. If this adhesive is applied thinly enough and doesn't pool anywhere, it dries completely matte and doesn't change the color of the soil. The adhesive strength is also quite good. While it would still come off with the finger, even after blowing on it or shaking it, everything stays where it should. If you don't have such an adhesive on hand, you can also use diluted white glue and a drop of alcohol to break the surface tension. However, white glue tends to dry in a very thin film with visible residue. Another thing I like about this glue is that it doesn't affect the actual shape of the soil particles. Because of this, once the glue has dried, you really can't tell anything is actually glued together. Meanwhile, our acrylic mud has dried, so we can continue below. I'm now applying another mud effect to the acrylic mud, this time enamel based. This is used to create soft transitions and add a very fine texture. Compared to the previous effect, this one can be blended much more easily and precisely using white spirit. This creates a realistic transition between coarse mud and fine dust. It does look like I'm adding quite a lot here, and to be honest, I thought it was at this step that I ruined the entire lower hull. But as is so often in the case, we have to continue to trust the process. These weathering steps are always the ones where I'm most afraid of ruining the entire model. Hours of time and work invested in the paintwork and details, and it can all go wrong. And it certainly has gone wrong in the past, which is why I'm always a bit more cautious with these effects these days. The wheels are one of these areas where I'm sometimes unsure if I overdid it. Fortunately, these are also the areas where a lot of mud and dust is realistically. The tracks will now receive this mud again as a wash. However, it will be far more diluted to look more like dust. Now I need the airbrush again. The fine dust has no texture at this scale, therefore pre-dusting with an airbrush is very suitable. I also spray it on the areas at the front and rear above the running gear, where I will later apply mud splatters. If the spare tracks are hanging in suitable locations, pre-dusting is also advisable. The rough texture of the rusting steel would attract dust very quickly. But keep in mind how high the track links are hanging. The Jagdtiger in particular is very tall, so the uppermost track links would naturally remain a lot cleaner. Those who have been paying attention will surely have noticed that the mud is dark on the top and lighter underneath. Obviously, that can't stay that way. Therefore, I also use the pre-dusting to adjust the colors accordingly. It doesn't have to be the exact same color everywhere, but there shouldn't be any extreme differences. Right now, the mud is quite light and looks very flat and unnatural. So, to make it look more three-dimensional again, I'm using a dark brown wash. This allows me to bring out the details on the plastic parts and of the underlying textures. But most importantly, I'm creating the crucial color differences. Mud is rarely a single color. At the latest, when it gets wet, there are visible differences compared to dried mud. That's why I started with a lighter base layer. It's always easier to layer dark colors over lighter ones, especially with these kinds of effects here. I can soften the transitions again with white spirit. But be careful, since the enamel mud is directly underneath, too much white spirit can unintentionally dissolve that layer too. The nice thing is that this effect also dries matte and therefore looks less like wet mud and more like dark earth. I also used this effect on the hull. However, I have to say I'm not entirely satisfied with the result. I don't know why, but somehow the color gradients don't look the way I imagined it. Since it's hidden, it was okay, but I would have touched it up again if the area was more visible. By using vertical brush movements, I can also create some fine streaks to make the open areas a bit more interesting. I'm using this effect here as well. The dirt is already dark, but I want to adjust its color to match the lower part of the vehicle. This will make everything far more uniform and avoid a harsh break between the two halves of the vehicle. The effect of such details on the overall picture is actually greater than expected, especially if it later becomes a diorama. Next up are the mud splatters. And since the Jagdtiger is almost completely lacking its mud flaps, we can really let loose here. I apply it by spraying a brush loaded with splatter effects with air using my empty airbrush. The general areas where I have applied this effect are by no means random. First, we have the front and the rear. From both of these points, the tracks can fling mud and dirt upwards onto the hull. That's why mudguards are here in the first place. I keep the center of the vehicle mostly clean. A small, fast vehicle would quickly become covered in mud, but the Jagdtiger's size and resulting slow speed mean it travels much more slowly. Therefore, it doesn't get as dirty while driving, especially not so high up. Mud splashes all the way up to the top of the substructure would be a rarity if they happen at all. That area would more likely get dirty from the dirt washed down from the roof during rain. But I've already covered that with the previous streaks. I'm also using different colors and consistencies for the splashes, similar to the colors I have used before. This airbrush technique requires some caution. It's quite easy to apply too many splatters. While this can be corrected with white spirit, once you have multiple layers down, it can mean starting over. Therefore, I always tested everything on a piece of kitchen roll. If you don't want to use an airbrush, you can also flick the brush with something like a toothpick. However, with such a large vehicle, that could certainly take a bit longer. Our bare metal parts still look a bit flat. To give them the necessary shine, I'm using a soft pencil, something between 2B and 6B would work well. I'm now carefully rubbing it over all the metal parts, especially the tow cables. The fine textures will become immediately visible, while the subtle rust effects remain between. Our tank is almost finished now, and since I don't want to do anything more on the running gear, it's time to attach the road wheels and tracks. I did this without a camera, because it was a bit fiddly, but in the end everything fits nicely. And my design from part 1 with the open track links worked exactly as intended. A few drops of superglue and the track is firmly attached. And even the suspension and tracks actually remained movable the whole time. The tracks still need to be painted to match the darker shade. Why did I wait until now? Simple. Now I only have to paint half the tracks, since the lower part isn't visible anyway. Work smart, not hard. The airbrush is needed once more. I would like to have some soot and smoke at the end of the gun barrel to show that the Jagdtiger has only recently fired shots. And since I currently have black paint in my airbrush, I can also spray the tips of the exhaust pipes black. The airbrush is very well suited for this, as it allows me to achieve a smooth transition. The backside still looked a bit bare. The mud flaps would catch a bit, but mud would still definitely accumulate in these spots. As before, I'm using 2 different shades of paint for this. The spare track links already had a rust wash, but once they were in place, I wasn't entirely happy with their color. Also, they wouldn't all rust to the same degree, as some might be newer and therefore still look fresher. That's why I used AK's weathering pencils to add some extra rust effects to a few links. I always dampen my brush with a little water and then pick up paint from the tip of the pencil. Considering they are just watercolor pencils, I'm always very pleased with the result they produce. And that is it for this episode. The Jagdtiger is finished, more or less. A few minor changes might come when I get around to making the diorama, but for now, that is it. This is almost certainly the biggest tank I have built so far. And definitely a classic that I absolutely needed in my collection. All in all, I'm quite satisfied with the result, and it was a really interesting kit. Now it would be interesting to build the apparently much more popular one from Tarkom for comparison. Originally I had a completely different image in mind, with snow camouflage and wet mud, but that changed during the build for various reasons, but perhaps for a future project. As for future projects, I have already planned quite a few things and even started some construction. I don't want to give too much away just yet, but with the next projects we will be looking at the present and even the future, so stay tuned. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe to never miss any future uploads. Any feedback or suggestions, let me know in the comments. Thank you all for watching, and see you next time.